Hi, everybody, and welcome back to First Chapter Friday with me, Mrs. Jenner. So, for this week's reading, I want to share with you the introduction to a nonfiction book called We Are Power: How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. I wanted to share it with you today because of what is happening in our world and in our society right now. I think it's very relevant to our current situation, and I hope that you can find some connections and inspiration within this text. Before I start reading, I want to warn you I have a rather persistent tickle in my throat, and I hope I can make it through without stopping. But if you find that there's some weird pause in this video, it's because I had to pause it and try and get the tickle out so that I could start reading again. So again, I apologize if that's what happens, but we're going to try. So again, it's called We Are Power: How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. The introduction is titled Rethinking History: Who Makes It and How. When we think about the history of the United States since the start of the 20th century, a range of events come to mind. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the assassination of JFK, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the moon landing, the invention of the internet, 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War. Excuse me. What does this list tell us? Well, almost half of it is wars, which maybe shouldn't come as a surprise. We're often taught that history revolves around wars because wars decisively change the path of history. In a war, power belongs to the politicians who declare war and to the generals who wage the battles. In the 20th century alone, 187 million people died in wars around the world as armies clashed again and again. But what about the other events here? A couple relate to technology and innovation. Almost all of the rest involves civilians claiming power for themselves and doing so violently by taking the lives of others through assassinations or terrorism. Does that mean history is mostly violence? If the answer is yes, then are you powerless to shape the future if you're not a politician or a general or someone willing to take someone else's life? Here are two other major events from the same time period. The ratification of the 19th Amendment granting women suffrage the right to vote in 1920, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act outlawing racial segregation in 1964. These events changed millions of lives. One finally gave half the population a voice. The other ended decades of legal, institutionalized racism. History is more than wars and violence. In fact, history has often been forged through the conflicts of a different sort, when huge numbers of people banded together to fight and sacrifice for their side without ever joining a conventional army or resorting to violence. Incredible individuals, who were not politicians or generals, led these movements. In the case of the 19th Amendment, the people who fought were mostly women. They had almost no official voice in the political process and no armed soldiers on their side. But eventually, these women overpowered and eventually persuaded an American president and a majority of the country's male elected officials to back their cause. The people who fought for the Civil Rights Act were mostly African Americans. Discriminated against and marginalized by the very racism they opposed, these men and women were regularly denied the vote. Often they were violently attacked. But in the end, they convinced great numbers of white Americans and the white politicians who represented them to reject the racism that once ruled their lives. In both conflicts, one side was excluded from governance and had no conventional weapons, yet this side prevailed each time, and without shedding their opponent's blood. So what was the source of their remarkable power? Nonviolent activism. Alice Paul led the final push for the 19th Amendment. She was a Quaker woman with no access to the voting booth. Martin Luther King Jr. led the call for the Civil Rights Act. He was a Baptist minister who held no public office and couldn't drink from the same water fountains as whites. Both Paul and King were activists who inspired, mobilized, and organized vast numbers of people to unite in order to struggle and sacrifice together for their causes. Operating outside of government institutions and rejecting nonviolent methods, women's suffrage and the civil rights movement used nonviolent resistance to transform their people's weakness into strength and change the course of history. Nonviolent activism isn't just an American phenomenon. Perhaps the greatest nonviolent struggle of all, the Indian independence movement, led by Mohandas K. Gandhi, ended nearly 200 years of British colonial rule and brought freedom to 300 million people without a bloody war of independence. Nonviolent struggles also helped overthrow totalitarian regimes shaped by the Soviet Union, one of the largest, most powerful, and most repressive countries ever. Many times in the past, nonviolent resistance has prevailed, shifting the course of history as much as a war without firing a single shot. So maybe we've been getting our history wrong, or at least very incomplete. But what exactly is nonviolent activism? Is any activism that rejects violence automatically considered nonviolent activism? No. Nonviolent activists employ disruptive, risky tactics that challenge those in power and interrupt the way things normally work without taking up arms. As we'll see in the chapters that follow, nonviolent activists can call on all sorts of techniques and tactics to advance their cause. Gene Sharp, a scholar of nonviolent activism, put together a list of all the methods that have been used in nonviolent struggles around the world. How many entries made his list? 198. Protests, strikes, boycotts, and international law breaking, what's called civil disobedience, are just some of the best known methods nonviolent activists can use. But whatever techniques they eventually choose, their successful application first requires the organization and mobilization of large groups of people willing to challenge the powers that be. Quite often, the initial stages of organization require activism that, while peaceful, isn't technically nonviolent activism. Why? Because this organization takes place within institutions and systems that are entirely legal and permitted by the government. Of course, there's a bell. For instance, when women won the right to vote in the United States in 1920, but their movement, the suffrage movement, actually started way back in 1848. For many decades, suffragists held meetings, gave speeches, circulated petitions, wrote editorials, lobbied politicians, and even went to court to argue the law already gave them the right to vote. This institutional activism raised awareness, shifted public opinion, brought thousands and thousands of people into the movement, and even won some victories, such as when individual states amended their constitutions to give women the vote. But as vital as these methods were, they weren't truly the stuff of nonviolent activism. It was only after 60 plus years of playing by the rules in order to change these rules that some suffragists decided it was time for a more radical approach. It was time to bend and even break the rules. That's when nonviolent activism entered the movement in the form of sustained protest, civil disobedience, and hunger strikes. In most of the stories you'll read in this book, institutional activism forms the backdrop of the conflicts and movements in question. Gandhi was an activist lawyer before becoming a nonviolent activist willing to break the law. The disruptive Montgomery bus boycott was inspired in part by court victories declaring segregation unconstitutional. And before leading the farm workers strike and Great Boycott, Cesar Chavez set about organizing farm workers in a union. Institutional activism is crucial to fighting for justice, and there are plenty of great books about that kind of activism. But this book focuses on those times when such activism isn't enough, when injustice is so stubborn that more drastic action is needed. So that's what nonviolent activism is. But how does it work? In an age when armies are stronger than ever before, when guns seem to be everywhere, how can people defeat their adversaries without resorting to violence themselves? The best way to answer these questions is by telling the stories of some of the most incredible, inspiring, nonviolent struggles of the last 100 years, which isn't to say that nonviolent resistance is a new phenomenon. Not at all. In fact, its history goes back many centuries and includes even the biblical Jesus among its innumerable practitioners. But the simple method of pursuing justice has seen a remarkable resurgence over the last century. And as we'll see, though these movements have much in common, each conflict is unique and teaches us something new about how and why nonviolent action works. Yet all of these stories do have one thing in common: nonviolent activists who have chosen to fight against injustice and the people behind it. You might think that someone who practices nonviolence must hate conflict, but the exact opposite is true. Nonviolent activists are fighters who directly challenge their opponents. Only the wars they wage look a lot different than the ones that take place on a military battlefield. I wrote this book because I believe that nonviolence, even more effective than it is peaceful, is a better way to fight. Indeed, it may well be the best way to fix our broken world. I hope after reading these pages you'll agree and be inspired to join those already fighting for change non-violently. And then the first story is Gandhi's. So, We Are Power: How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. It's in our library. I'm going to go quarantine it so that you all can check it out soon and let me know what you think.